Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. I'm really glad that you're here. Today's webinar is on building healthy love and navigating the modern relationship. Thank you, Pineapple Support, for inviting me to facilitate this webinar. I am Dr. Tess Kilwein, and I'm a therapist with Pineapple Support. Many of you tuning in today work in an industry that already challenges a lot of traditional ideas about intimacy, relationships, and boundaries. So today's webinar is not about judgment or telling people how a relationship should or shouldn't work. Instead, we're going to talk about what actually makes relationships healthy, what makes them sustainable in the long term, and really central focus on emotional and psychological safety within those relationships. Now, this applies to people of all relationship structures, those who are monogamous, non-monogamous, partnered, dating, and even taking a break from it all. Thanks again for joining me today, and let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with, what do we mean by healthy? When people hear this phrase, healthy relationship, they often imagine it looks like something conflict-free or effortless or just like constantly fulfilling and joyful. And despite what television shows us, I'm here to tell you that that is not realistic all of the time. And it also shouldn't necessarily be the goal. So if we think of healthy relationships, what we want people to feel and experience in those relationships is a sense of emotional and physical safety. So feeling safe in those relationships, both from a physical standpoint, of course, but also emotionally, that you can be your authentic self, that you can share hard parts of you and have hard conversations. It's also where power is not being abused. And that power doesn't necessarily have to be physical, right? So there are different power structures in relationships, whether that be socially, financially, age, whatever it might be. And so ensuring that that power dynamic is not being abused in the relationship. Healthy relationship is also one where communication is possible, even when things are really uncomfortable or distressing. So even when there is maybe conflict or a disagreement or something going on in that relationship, your separate lives, your lives together, that communication still feels possible, even in those hard times. Now, as I mentioned on the last slide, healthy relationships exist across many structures. This includes monogamy, ethical non-monogamy, polyamory, and open relationships. There has been this historical sense of like the only healthy relationship is this really strong monogamous one. And that is just not the truth, right? And so these aspects, emotional and physical safety, no power imbalances or abuse of that power, open communication is possible even when things are uncomfortable. That exists across all, the possibility of that exists across many structures. And it's that structure itself that matters far less than how people actually treat each other within that structure. So why are we talking about modern relationships? What does that mean? So let's talk about the reality of modern relationships. These relationships currently exist in a world of constant access, right? And so we think of maybe our parents and our grandparents, they weren't able to communicate in often the same ways that we do. When we think of texts, DMs, constant internet access, we're able to stay connected in ways that sometimes in this industry in particular can blur work, intimacy, and rest. It's really hard to shut things off when we have this constant access to all kinds of things. So, for the adult industry, the online adult industry in particular, this blurred line can become really, really intense, right? We may exist in kind of this virtual space professionally, and then shutting that off or existing then in our personal lives can get really blurred and really challenging. So for those of you tuning in today, your work may or likely involve some form of sexual expression, some form of emotional labor that you're sharing with your clients or having to put on for your clients, and connection, right? Even when that's through the screen. So this work is really intimate and expressive. Now, if you're in a relationship structure where maybe your partner is less familiar with the industry, they may not fully understand the difference between this professional intimacy that you're engaging in online and personal intimacy that is reserved for your relationships in person. So, healthy relationships, healthy modern relationships, and especially those that exist in the online industry, require even more open conversations than maybe a less modern or more traditional relationship might, because this is the reality of the work that we do. So we can't necessarily assume that your partners are just going to get it without any conversation, which is why we're really focused on this today. How do we communicate with our partners about this industry, about the need for boundaries and the separation between professional and personal life? You'll hear me just hammer away at open communication, right? So, open communication, when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean we just say everything the moment that it pops into our head. It doesn't mean we engage in, impulsive communication or manipulative communication, right? It means that we intentionally share relevant information about our professional and personal lives with honesty and respect for the other person. And that sometimes means you have to consider the timing and emotional capacity of everyone involved. So when I talk about, saying things the moment it pops in your head, right in the moment, that might sound like the right thing to do, but it sort of neglects maybe the needs and the capacity of our partners. So it's finding that balance of we want to be honest, we want to be respectful in that communication, but that there are multiple people involved in truly open communication and respecting the boundaries of everyone in that system. So think of healthy communication. This is something that involves checking in with your partner or your partners, asking questions, being curious, and then being willing to repair misunderstandings if and when they do happen in that dynamic. At the same time, it really means recognizing that our partners may need time to process. They may be less familiar with emotional openness in relationships, with your work, your personal lives. So, especially when we discuss things like boundaries, jealousy, insecurity, you may be coming into the relationship in different places. One person may have more experience with those topics, both in their professional and personal life, than the other one. And these are really emotionally charged things, right? So when we have these conversations, recognizing, A, we want to be honest and not hold things back in our relationships, and recognizing that some people may need more time, they may need more structure, whatever it may be, to have these difficult conversations. So when I talk about open communication, you'll see on this slide that it works best when it's ongoing. So this is thinking about how do we be preventative in our conversations versus solely reactive. So we don't wait until something goes wrong. We don't wait until there's been a boundary crossing or a significant misunderstanding to have communication. To the extent that we can, we want to talk about what could come up in this relationship. Where could the boundaries between personal and professional life get blurred? Of course, we can't prevent any misunderstanding, but the key is how do we think of these are the unique aspects of our relationship or my professional life that might impact the relationship? Having those conversations early and often, and then again, being willing to repair any misunderstandings should they happen in the context of the relationship. Boundaries are love. This is something I, again, just kind of share with everyone that I work with is that boundaries are sometimes misunderstood as walls or ultimatums, right? In reality, what boundaries are supposed to be is clarification, right? So when you set a boundary, you are defining what you are responsible for and what you are not responsible for. So when we do boundaries well, they protect relationships from things like resentment and burnout in the long run. They don't cause that resentment and the burnout in the long run. So when we're looking at boundaries, they should be protecting your peace. They should be protecting the peace of the relationship, not creating more conflict, right? So I think of an example of someone may set a boundary of like, I don't talk about that, or we don't talk about that in this relationship. Now, that is not the same thing as, hey, I need a different time or a different space to discuss this aspect of a relationship. So it has to involve some type of compromise from both parties. It can't be shoving things under the rug, but it can also be recognizing, hey, in this moment, I don't have the capacity to have that conversation or comfort you in the way that you may need. When is a good time that we can revisit this together and doing that in a really collaborative way? So, an example in this industry of a boundary might sound like I don't discuss work details with my partner, or I need alone time after streaming to create some separation. Now, this first one is tricky. I don't discuss work details with my partner. You, of course, want to define what that means from the beginning of your relationship versus your months into a relationship. They don't know what you do for work. They have some questions, and then it causes a conflict at that point. So you may start a relationship and decide, hey, I don't discuss these specific aspects of my work with my partners. Is that something that you're comfortable with? You set that boundary, and then you're able to reinforce it over time. I need alone time after streaming. Again, the purpose of this is to protect your peace, protect the relationship's peace, rather than create conflict. I recognize that after I'm done streaming, I'm not in a place where I can jump right back into my personal life and create that separation. I need to be able to set that boundary so I can be really present for you in our relationship. So think of these things as, again, positive aspects, things that protect you and your relationship rather than things that shut doors in an unnecessary way. Something to also keep in mind is that boundaries are not meant to control the behavior of someone else. And I think we see this less common, but if someone is using a boundary to control your behavior, they're saying, well, my boundary is I need to know exactly what you're talking about with every client. I need to view all of your work before you share it online because I want to have a say. Now that gets into this territory of controlling. So boundaries are complicated, but in the end, if boundaries are good and healthy in your relationship, they're going to feel a lot like love. Doesn't mean that they're always comfortable in the moment, but they're going to feel more like love than they're going to feel like control or resentment over time. So the key here is that boundaries should be naming what you need in order to stay regulated, engaged in your relationship, not withdraw or create distance from that relationship. Lastly, they should not be used as an excuse to ignore someone else's needs. So this is where I share the example of like, I don't discuss those details or I'm not able to have that conversation right now. But then you ask the question, okay, when can we revisit it, right? And so we can't shut off all communication. We can't use them as an excuse to like not provide any comfort to a partner or not answer questions that they have. It's sometimes, okay, when is the best place for us? When, where, how is the best place to have that conversation? And sometimes that's not in the immediate moment. Boundaries are complicated, actually, the more we break it down, right? And so creating healthy and productive boundaries in a relationship sometimes takes some work and some practice. Sometimes it takes accidental violations and then repairing that and better understanding it moving forward. So let's talk a little bit more about relationship structures and how this applies to modern dating. As I mentioned from the beginning, there is no single relationship structure that automatically prevents harm in a relationship. Again, I think there's long been this misunderstanding that the only healthy way to navigate a relationship is through monogamy. But the reality is, monogamy can be healthy or unhealthy. Non-monogamy can be healthy or unhealthy. What matters more than the structure itself is whether that structure aligns with the needs, the values, and the capacity of people involved. And that's really key, right? So sometimes we'll have folks in a relationship where maybe that structure is really what they're looking for and aligned for them. And then they're matched with a partner that's different. That's going to pose conflicts in a relationship. That's going to become a challenge. So all people entering a structure need to take a look and do a little reflection on what type of structure actually aligns with my needs, values, capacity. Maybe my capacity is broader than one relationship. Maybe it's less than a relationship with multiple people and I need to make some changes. So that work often needs to be done in an individual way before you can enter relationship structures with someone else. Now, what can happen here is that when partners assume that they're aligned with a partner without actually talking about expectations, rules, emotional limits, or future plans, then it can cause a misalignment. So I think the key here is that like monogamy isn't necessarily the norm, and having conversations with your partners very early on of like what structure aligns with your needs, not assuming that's monogamy, not assuming it's non-monogamy in the long term for anyone you're interacting with, and just having those conversations pretty early and often checking back in, making sure you fully understand kind of what your limits and your future plans are. Because it's not uncommon for people to be in a relationship, get really comfortable, and then not communicate with each other when some of those things change over time. That's when we find conflict. That's when we find boundary crossings. So key here is, I'm talking about monogamy, non-monogamy, but the key is that like these labels don't replace conversations. No one structure is exactly the same. It's really deeply personal to people and their partners. And so, not assuming that one label or one way that you entered a relationship is not going to change or adapt or be flexible over time. Just really having those conversations early and often. And now our favorite topics, jealousy, insecurity, and comparison in relationships. These are tough, tough things, but the reality is jealousy, insecurity show up in almost every relationship at some point. Now, I really want to emphasize here that feeling jealous, feeling insecure, comparing yourself to other people or relationship types, that doesn't automatically make you immature or broken or unfit for connection. I think a lot of folks are afraid to express jealousy, insecurity in their relationships because they don't want to be labeled as immature. They don't want maybe difficult parts of themselves to be revealed in a relationship. Instead, how we should look at these things is something important is being activated in you. If you're feeling jealous, you're feeling insecure, there's something within you, your experiences, your mental health, unclear agreements that might be activated. So, some examples of ways that this can show up for people. One, fear of loss. So maybe someone has been abandoned in the past. Maybe that's in their early childhood. Maybe that's a past relationship. And that fear of loss or fear of abandonment is now showing up as something like insecurity in a new relationship. Unmet needs is another one. So, especially those that were neglected in early childhood. I'm not going to get too far into attachment theory here, but what we know about attachment styles is they develop from a very young age, from very young experiences that we have with people in our lives, often our caregivers. And when a need was unmet in early childhood, we often seek out experiences to meet that need in adulthood. So this is where sometimes people are seeking maybe reassurance. They're comparing themselves to a lot and need that reassurance that they're still going to be chosen. Doesn't mean that person's immature or broken and can't, create a more stable attachment over time, but it's a signal that maybe there's an unmet, usually emotional need that's showing up in the relationship. A third signal can be past experiences. So maybe it's infidelity in a past relationship that's being activated. Maybe there was a history of abuse, power, or control in a previous relationship that's being activated. Maybe someone was really blindsided in a relationship, and at one point they really trusted their judgment and decision making, and then someone really shook that for them. So again, goal here is not to eliminate things like jealousy, insecurity, comparison, but to better understand, be able to manage that, and provide a level of self-assurance to yourself, and then some level of kind of security in the relationship too. Lastly, like we talked about on the last slide, is these unclear agreements or assumptions that your relationship structure with someone is aligned and value based. These kind of unclear, blurred agreements, this is where jealousy is more likely to arise, right? So when the relationship boundaries aren't clearly communicated between each other, that is when it creates the space for if there's an assumption I'm creating and I'm filling the space with my past experiences or the experiences of someone else that I've heard of. So when you don't have that open conversation, it just creates more room for these kind of things to present in a relationship. Now, the key in all of this is to some extent, yes, it is someone's individual responsibility to recognize that something like this is being activated in them. At the same time, a healthy relationship makes space to talk about these feelings without shaming or judging them. So, making space to talk about them, understand them, is not the same as being responsible for them in someone else, but it's allowing the psychological safety for someone to recognize these things are being activated, providing a level of reassurance that that person can then seek out opportunities to self-assure themselves to better understand these emotions that show up. So again, we want to make space for the feelings, but it shouldn't mean there's an expectation that one partner is constantly managing the other's emotions, right? So there needs to be a level of safety and reassurance so an individual person has kind of the safety to understand where these things are coming from and heal them. Balance, it's tough. Let's talk a little bit more about work and love. This is so important for this audience and this industry in particular. So, when we think of people in the online adult industry, one of the biggest relationship stressors that comes up, and at least that I work with, is the misunderstanding between the partners about the scope of the work, what it entails, fear of disclosing details of that, and then there's misunderstandings. It's just a really intimate conversation and sometimes challenging lines to navigate in a relationship. So, like I mentioned before, if you're a performer yourself, like your work may involve sexuality, but that doesn't mean that your boundaries disappear at home. And unfortunately, this is a field that can become really sexualized in a way that violates boundaries or assumes things about a partner because it's present in their professional life, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's okay and present in their personal life. So this is a key for performers is recognizing that you have a right to set boundaries and separation and differences between your work life and your personal life. So unfortunately, I've heard one too many examples of the, well, you do that in that space, so why can't you do it here? You show that to other people, so why can't you show it to me? And that is just a relationship red flag, especially for this industry, because it becomes a slippery slope. So, healthy partners, modern relationships respect the difference between your professional role and your personal self, and recognizing that the boundaries and the expectations and behaviors and whatever it may be from one space should not automatically be assumed in another one. So, honestly, if there's one major takeaway from this entire presentation, I hope that it is that you have a right to create boundaries and differences between your professional life and your personal life, and no partner has a right to force any blurring of that you don't consent to. You also aren't obligated to justify your work endlessly or constantly carry a partner's discomfort without limits. So, of course, modern dating, especially if your partner or partners are newer to dating someone in your line of work, there is, a bit of an obligation to have some open communication, talk about expectations, be transparent, to some extent, right? So the expectation can't be you're continually having to justify your work over time when you've had that conversation, right? Or that you have to carry their discomfort and comfort them over time for the same thing, right? And so at some point, we have to look at our relationships and say, I have set this boundary, I have clarified this, I have provided the reassurance that I can. And if these things persist beyond that, it's possible that dating a partner in this industry is not in that person's best interest. And that's really hard because sometimes there's a lot of love for someone and the work life doesn't balance in that way. So my key is you should not have to choose between work and love. And that can be hard, again, because we may love someone and it's not conducive to the work or vice versa. But you have a right to say that I can't carry the discomfort of this relationship if I want to stay in this line of work. So, mutual respect in these relationships include respecting your autonomy, that you get to make decisions about your career, respecting your livelihood, that if this is the way that you're choosing to have financial security in your life, you get to make that choice. And your identity, so the way that you show up and present yourself to the world and what's important to you in both that occupational space and that personal space. Your partner should respect that. If they don't, and over time they can't get there and they're not demonstrating that respect, you have the right to say, this is not the relationship for me. And again, I think that's hard for people to acknowledge. So as the slide says, I think the key here is like we do have a responsibility to some extent, like educate our partners, communicate, let them know what's going on. But you do not have to over-explain yourself time and time again. Okay, let's talk a little bit about just kind of these explicit signs of a healthy relationship. How do you know if you're actually in one? I think this conversation can feel really abstract until we talk about what it actually looks like in a relationship. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, a healthy relationship is not defined by the absence of conflict, but how you handle that conflict. Conflict is going to arise in almost every relationship. If it's not arising at all in a relationship, I encourage you to ask the question, are there things that we're avoiding? And that's why there's no conflict. Hey, if you've got someone there's very little conflict with, and you're very open and you handle challenges, great and outstanding. But I think to put that expectation on every relationship can be pretty harmful. So, some questions you can ask yourself to try and identify, is this a healthy modern relationship? Is this working for me? Number one, do you feel safe expressing disagreements with your partner? So let's say a boundary has been crossed, they've done something that caused you harm, you feel differently about a situation than they do. Do you feel safe expressing that to your partner? If you don't, something's being avoided, and you got to ask yourself why. Might mean there's a lack of emotional or unfortunately physical safety in that relationship. Another question you can ask is there accountability when harm occurs? And this goes for all partners, right? So if you make a mistake in the relationship, do you recognize, okay, I respect this person enough to let them know that is harm that I caused. I'm taking some accountability for that, and you move forward together. At the same time, is your partner doing the same on the other end? Now, the odds are that any individual, you included, me included, is never going to cause any element of harm in their relationship, that they're never going to make a mistake, that they're never going to misread something, they're never going to communicate something a little too early or a little too late. It's just not realistic, right? And so the key here is not the absence of conflict, it's how do you handle it when it comes up? Do you take that accountability? Do you apologize? Do you commit to doing differently the next time? And that needs to go always in a partnership. Last one. Are you allowed to grow and change? This one can be really hard. Sometimes we enter relationships a little different version of ourselves than we may be today. And again, goes for all partners. So, is there this space for individuality? Is there this space for becoming into a different version of myself? Maybe my values change over time. Maybe my priorities change, right? Like, is there a safe space for that in a relationship? That's really key, right? And so if someone in a relationship is making comments like, well, you weren't this way a year ago, or you wouldn't have allowed this a year ago, or you would have allowed this a year ago as an excuse to violate a boundary, that's a red flag, right? So are you allowed to grow and change is a question to be asking yourself. Key here, you should not have to shrink or twist or hide or constantly perform emotional labor to keep a relationship intact. And if you're feeling like you really have to kind of walk on eggshells or you really have to, again, like shrink yourself, minimize yourself, twist yourself in your words into a way that's palatable for the other person or the other people, that's just exhausting and that's not a sign of a healthy relationship. So, in the end, healthy love makes room for individuality, who you are, your values, your friendships, your priorities, alongside connection and collaboration with those partners. Now, sometimes it's actually easier to recognize the relationship red flags than it is to maybe talk about signs of a healthy relationship. So, let's talk about some signs that a relationship may not be the healthiest. And this is tough because, as I mentioned, no relationship is perfect. No relationship is never going to have a boundary crossed, never going to have um, the perfect level of reassurance, all these things, right? And so the key here is that typically when it's a red flag, it's going to be something that happens over and over, right? It's either something really major or some type of crossing, boundary crossing that happens over and over. So red flags, think of them more as patterns in a relationship than isolated moments that someone takes accountability for, they learn from, and they do differently the next time. That is the way that I would differentiate it. So again, mistakes happen in a relationship. That includes boundary crossings, and that is especially before those boundaries are made really clear. So in the beginning of a relationship, I think it's really hard to assure a full level of psychological safety when you don't know someone's triggers, you don't know their history. A lot of these expectations and rules of engagement haven't been clearly made. So some level of flexibility and adaptability in a beginning of a relationship is warranted. But if you're finding that continues over time, there's a lack of accountability, there's no change or growth, that's when it turns into a red flag. What I would encourage people to do is one, pay attention to those repeated boundary crossings. You have established a boundary. You have shared this is something that causes me harm, or this is something I need in a relationship, and they continue to violate or push up against that boundary. You've had that conversation so many times, you've asked that thing so many times, and it continues to happen. That is more of a chronic boundary violation you want to pay attention to. Another one is attempts to control your time or relationships. So this is when we get into more of that like abuse of power, control piece. So let's say they're controlling when you can stream, when you can engage in certain type of content, create certain content, um, when you're allowed to socialize with people, even outside of work. If you find that someone's becoming more controlling with your time or your relationships of like, this is who you can engage with and this is who you can't, those efforts to control, that's something to really watch out for as a red flag in a relationship. Last one would be just like invalidation of your work, your values, who you are, constantly putting you down, convincing you that you're less than, making you feel shame for what you choose to do in either your professional or personal life. If someone is consistently making those comments, right, that add up over time, that's when we're looking at something that is a pattern in a relationship, not an isolated moment. I don't think it's uncommon for someone to make maybe a misguided comment, right? Or accidentally express judgment when they don't fully understand this work, especially at the beginning of a relationship. But if you're finding after you've clarified that, after you've provided education, you have had that open communication in your relationship, they continue to do that thing, put you down, incite fear, make you question your morals, your values. That is when it is more of a pattern over time that you want to watch out for. Key here is you deserve, yes, you deserve relationships where your autonomy is respected, that you can choose this line of work, and you shouldn't be choosing between a relationship, satisfaction, and safety and your line of work. Both of those can be equally protected and both of those can be equally chosen. If you feel like you can't, then one thing has to go in the end, right? And I'd be hesitant to tell someone like your work needs to go to comfort someone else that entered the relationship in a way you were authentic and honest about what you do. So sometimes it makes having to ask, is this the right relationship for me? Does it align with my values? Does it respect my autonomy? You're allowed to ask those questions. Most importantly, love does not require you to tolerate fear, coercion, or emotional harm. That is not love. And while boundaries are love, control, and coercion are not. So, with that, to wrap up today's webinar, I want to leave you with just a few key points. One, healthy relationships are not something we magically know how to do. And especially for folks that maybe haven't had great models of those relationships throughout their lifetime. The things I presented and talked about today are not just things that everybody knows and should be expected to know and understand and bring into every relationship. So if you're tuning in today and you're like, gosh, these things have really been present in a lot of my relationships, or hey, maybe I've done that thing in a relationship that isn't super healthy. Um, Today was not about judgment. Shame does do nothing to help promote positive behavior change. So just recognize these are not things that we magically know how to do. And the fact that you're here today indicates there's some willingness to learn and grow. So the way that we create healthy relationships is through experience. And this may be experience learning what is healthy or what is not healthy, reflection, so reflecting on the roles that you've played in relationships or the things that you tolerated that you would hope to not tolerate in the future, and sometimes support. So, yes, sometimes running a situation by a friend or a colleague or a family member of yours, reaching out when things get tough, or, maybe you have harmed someone and then getting some support so you know how to not do the same in the future. Now, I want to recognize that, especially in this space, there are a lot of folks who have experienced trauma and abuse in their past, both in early childhood and in relationships. So, what that means is some of us here have had more models of unhealthy relationships than of healthy relationships. So, it can take some time to learn and unlearn new ways of loving and being in a relationship. So, that might mean, okay, a little bit more work you have to do before you're ready for this healthy relationship, and that's okay. That's not your fault. That's something that's been done to you. And most importantly, if I have not made this clear, you are allowed to leave relationships that no longer serve your well-being, even if they once did. So you are allowed to leave a person who is making you choose between work and love. You're also allowed to leave a relationship that really served you at the beginning, and now you have changed and grown, or that person has changed and grown or ungrown. You are allowed to decide that's not the relationship for you. So, in closing, if today brought up questions or feelings, maybe it activated something from you in the past, just a reminder that Pineapple Support is a service that offers confidential and industry affirming resources to those in the adult industry. This includes one-to-one sessions, so meeting with an individual therapist to talk on a little bit more personal level about things that you've been through and how they're showing up in your relationships. Maybe on one of these slides, you're like, dang, yeah, jealousy and insecurity is really present for me. And now Dr. Tess told me that it means something's activated in me. You can work through that with an individual therapist. That's what we're here for. Pineapple Support also offers a range of groups and workshops. So, groups would be a space where you're with folks who've maybe experienced similar concerns or share similar identities, and you can work through some of these things together. Workshops are more kind of presentation style, that there's a little bit of engagement. And then, of course, there's a whole directory of these on-demand webinars that you're watching now. So, of course, new webinars are released each month, but there's this whole directory of on-demand webinars, both on the Pineapple Support website and on YouTube, that include a lot focused on relationships. So, I know I had mentioned attachment styles, and here we've got some related to that. We've got just all different kinds of navigating relationship type of stuff in the industry. So, at the end of the day, remember that you are not alone in navigating this. You are certainly not the only person watching this webinar and being like, dang, yeah, that applies to me. So take that as information. You are capable of a healthy relationship. Sometimes it just takes a little work. So, with that, thank you for being here and taking the time to invest in your relational well-being. Thank you to Pineapple Support for hosting this space. And as a reminder, my name is Dr. Tess Kilwein, a therapist with Pineapple Support. Take care.